The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the ancient city of Antioch. In the shimmering heat, bishops from across the empire made their way to the newly constructed Golden Church, summoned by Emperor Constantius himself. Among them strode Eusebius, the formidable bishop of Nicaea. Tall and stately, with sharp eyes and an aquiline nose, Eusebius had long been a leading voice against the Nicene Creed and its champion Athanasius. Now, in the year 341, he sensed an opportunity to deal a decisive blow. As the bishops filed into the glittering church with its golden dome, Eusebius spotted a familiar face, Acacius, the young bishop of Caesarea. Though much his junior, Acacius was a rising theologian and a staunch ally against Nicaea. Eusebius caught his eye and they exchanged nods of greeting. The council commenced with a reading from the Gospels, the lector's voice echoing in the cavernous space. Then Emperor Constantius, resplendent in imperial purple, stood to address the gathered bishops. "Esteemed fathers, I have called you here to bring unity and concord to the church. For too long, the heresy of Athanasius has brought division and strife. I charge you to produce a new creed, faithful to Scripture, to unite all Christians." Eusebius and Acacius exchanged glances. This was the opportunity they had hoped for. As the bishops broke into smaller groups to deliberate, the two men huddled together. "We must use language from the Bible," Eusebius said in a low voice. "Speak of the Son as the perfect image of the Father, the firstborn of creation, but avoid the Nicene formula." Acacius nodded. "I have some thoughts on how we can define the Trinity as three persons, distinct yet united in will. The Westerners may object, but with the emperor's backing, they'll have no choice but to accept it." For 3 sweltering summer days, the bishops debated and drafted, poring over passages from the Gospels and epistles. Gradually, a new creed took shape, one that skirted Nicaea without openly rejecting it. On the 4th day, Eusebius stood before the council to read out their work. As he reached the key passage on the Son's relation to the Father, he paused for effect. "We believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the only begotten of the Father, that is, of the essence of the Father, light of light, very God of very God, begotten, not made, of one essence with the Father." Murmurs of surprise rippled through the sweltering church. A few bishops nodded in approval, but others shifted uneasily on the hard marble benches. As the Lord himself says, "I and the Father are one," and again, "The Father is in me and I in him," Eusebius finished triumphantly. The Origenists had the upper hand. Nicaea was repudiated without being openly rejected. As the council concluded and the bishops dispersed, Eusebius stood with Acacius, watching their colleagues depart in the fading evening light. "We have prevailed today," Eusebius said in a satisfied tone. "But our work is not finished. Athanasius still has many supporters. We must ensure our creed spreads far and wide." Acacius laid a hand on the older man's shoulder. "With your wisdom and the emperor's favor, we will triumph in the end. The true faith will be restored." But their victory was short-lived. Even as the Origenists congratulated themselves, events conspired against them. In the West, Emperor Constans summoned his own council to Serdica, determined to vindicate Athanasius. Hosius of Cordoba, venerable advisor to Constanz's father Constantine, led a contingent of Western bishops to the frontier town high in the mountains of Thrace. When the Easterners realized the true purpose of the council, they refused to attend, withdrawing to nearby Philippopolis. The rival councils exchanged edicts of excommunication, each denouncing the other as heretics. Eusebius and his allies doubled down on their rejection of Nicaea, while Hosius and the Westerners upheld Athanasius and declared the Bishop of Rome the final authority in church matters. The rift between East and West gaped ever wider. For a few years, an uneasy truce prevailed. With Persia threatening war and his brother Constans holding the upper hand, Constantius reluctantly allowed Athanasius to return to his see in Alexandria. The emperor had no love for the stubborn Egyptian bishop, but knew it was unwise to provoke his powerful sibling. Athanasius entered Alexandria in triumph on a wave of popular acclaim. Meletian schismatics who had allied with the Arians found their churches emptied as the faithful flocked to hear the restored patriarch preach. Tall and dark-skinned, His black eyes flashing, Athanasius thundered against the heresies of Arius and his successors. They say the Son is not eternal, that he is inferior to the Father, but this is not the faith of the apostles, not the true doctrine of the Church. My brothers, hold fast to the Creed of Nicaea, the unshakable bedrock of our faith. For nearly a decade, Athanasius reigned supreme along the Nile. Choosing his allies from among the desert monks, he created a network of support that reached from the squalid alleys of Alexandria to the sun-baked monasteries of Cetus and Nitria. Acacius and his cohorts could only watch and fume. But Athanasius's enemies had not forgotten him. When Magnentius, a general of barbarian extraction, launched a coup against Constantius's brother Constans, Athanasius was falsely accused of supporting the usurper. Constantius saw his chance. Councils were called in Arles and Milan, far from Athanasius's base of support. Under the emperor's watchful eye, the assembled bishops were cajoled and threatened until they agreed, one by one, to denounce Athanasius. Only a few stalwarts held out. Hosius, nearly 100 years old, fired off a blistering letter to the emperor. God has put into your hand the kingdom. To us bishops, he has entrusted the affairs of his church. As he who would steal the empire from you would resist the ordinance of God, so likewise fear on your part, lest by taking upon yourself the government of the church, you become guilty of a great offense. Liberius, the bishop of Rome, sided with Hosius. Constantius responded by exiling them both, Hosius to the farthest reaches of the empire, Liberius to the bleak plains of Thrace. A more compliant bishop, Felix, was installed in Rome. Only in Gaul, on the far northwestern frontier, was resistance possible. There, Constantius's young cousin Julian exercised real authority as Caesar. More interested in philosophy than theology, Julian turned a blind eye as Hilary, the bishop of Poitiers, rallied the Nicene cause. But Julian's power was limited. When a council at Béziers denounced Hilary as a troublemaker, Constantius banished him to the opposite end of the Mediterranean. Hilary found himself an unexpected neighbor of Liberius in central Anatolia. With his enemies exiled or cowed into submission, the emperor finally moved against Athanasius. Imperial troops stormed the bishop's church in Alexandria. For a moment it seemed Athanasius would be captured, but his supporters spirited him away. Constantius installed George of Cappadocia, a former schoolmaster, as bishop in his place. Athanasius vanished into the desert. At the oasis of Sirmium, Eusebius' old allies Ursacius and Valens saw their chance. With Athanasius gone and Constantius wholly on their side, they drafted a creed that rejected Nicaea entirely. There are two persons of the Father and the Son, it declared, the Father greater, the Son subordinated to him. When the Creed of Sirmium was published, the anti-Nicene coalition crumbled. For years, they had been united only in their opposition to Athanasius and the Homoousios. Now they turned on one another. Basil of Ancyra, alarmed by the explicit subordination of the Son, called his own council to denounce Sirmium as the work of extreme Arians. Insisting that the Son was like in essence to the Father, neither identical nor inferior, Basil and his followers charted a middle course. The church fractured into squabbling factions. Constantius, desperate to impose unity, summoned the bishops to twin councils at Ariminum in Italy and Seleucia in Anatolia. Nearly 600 bishops heeded his summons in the greatest church assemblies yet seen. In Italy, Valens and Ursacius maneuvered relentlessly, aided by Constantius's man Taurus. They wore down the opposition with a combination of threats and cajolery until the exhausted Western bishops agreed to sign an ambiguous creed that spoke of the Son as merely like the Father. To the east, Acacius of Caesarea likewise pressed for a minimalist creed, arguing that it was unscriptural to speak of essence at all. Browbeaten and confused, the eastern bishops, too, gave way. By the fall of 359, nearly the entire church had signed the Creed of Nice, rejecting Nicaea without quite embracing Arianism. In the Egyptian desert, in a hidden monastery, Athanasius received the news with a heavy heart. Bearded and gaunt, much aged by his trials, he paced in his cell, grieving for the church. Will the faith of Nicaea, the true faith, be lost? He asked aloud. Will the Son be reduced to a subordinate creature? But the indignities Constantius inflicted on the Church would prove his undoing. When he tried to impose an Arian bishop on Constantinople itself, the people erupted in outrage. Rioting mobs filled the streets, crying, "Give us Nicaea! Give us Athanasius!" Constantius watched his authority crumble. From his exile in Gaul, his cousin Julian observed and planned. When the emperor died in 361, undone by his own policies, Julian the philosopher moved smoothly into the vacuum. The only prince of the imperial family who had never embroiled himself in the church's quarrels now ruled supreme. Julian's accession changed everything. Exiled bishops streamed back to their sees: Hilary to Poitiers, Liberius to Rome, Athanasius to Alexandria. George of Cappadocia was lynched by an angry mob. The emperor called a truce in the War of Creeds. "Let Galileans settle their own differences," he wrote. An edict of toleration was proclaimed, allowing all exiled clerics to return. From his desert refuge, Athanasius rode back into Alexandria, gaunt and gray-bearded. When he preached at the Easter Vigil, thousands wept openly, overjoyed at the return of their shepherd. Meanwhile, Julian himself prepared to turn the clock back. He ordered the pagan temples reopened, their confiscated property restored. Astrologers and philosophers flocked to the imperial court. The emperor spoke openly of his devotion to the gods. The peace in the church proved short-lived. As Athanasius moved to rally his followers, his enemies too took stock. Miletians whispered that the returned Alexandrian bishop was conspiring with rebels, while Acacius of Caesarea plotted to block any resurrection of Nicaea. Athanasius convened his own council in Alexandria to reassert the faith of Nicaea. As the bishops gathered, a sense of gravity filled the air. Athanasius himself seemed tired, his black eyes clouded with care, but he had lost none of his fire. "The faith handed down from the apostles is under attack as never before," the old bishop said, his voice cracking. "Will we surrender the truth? Will any here deny that the Son is God, equal to the Father?" The room erupted in shouts. "Never!
Athanasius contra mundum."
In that moment, it seemed possible Nicaea might triumph at last. But the desert monk had one last trial to face. Even as he met with his brother bishops, the emperor's men arrived with an order for his arrest. "Bishop Athanasius is a disturber of the peace, an intriguer, and an enemy of Greek wisdom," declared the tribune. "The Emperor Julian Augustus commands that he submit to imperial justice." Athanasius drew himself up to his full height, eyes flashing. "I submit to God alone. I will not hand myself over to an emperor who has turned his back on Christ." Uproar filled the hall. The Egyptian bishops surged forward, ready to defend their leader. As imperial troops advanced, Athanasius slipped away in the chaos. Once again, he vanished into the wilderness. Exasperated, Julian the apostate gave up on reconciling the Christians. "Let them fight one another," he declared. "We have more important matters to attend to." The emperor threw himself into his dream of a pagan restoration. Sacred groves were planted, altars restored, animal sacrifices performed to propitiate the gods. Even as he prepared a massive campaign against the Persians, Julian immersed himself in mystical rites. But his plans came to naught. In Persia, a chance arrow felled the apostate. As he lay dying, Julian uttered his famous last words, "You have won, Galilean." With Julian's death, the house of Constantine was extinguished. On the eastern frontier, an obscure military commander named Jovian found himself thrust onto the imperial throne. A Christian by upbringing, the new emperor moved quickly to make peace with Persia and restore the bishops whom Julian had exiled. From his hiding place, Athanasius re-emerged, dusty and disheveled, to reclaim his throne on the Nile. At Antioch, where he paused to receive the new emperor's blessing, a wary peace prevailed. But the dynamic bishop had one last labor to perform. Though nearly 70, he undertook a final voyage not to Nicaea or Antioch, but to the furthest edge of the known world, to the court of Aksum in Ethiopia. There, as tradition relates, He consecrated Frumentius, his disciple, as the first bishop to the Ethiopians. The light of Christ would not be extinguished. The Creed of Nicaea, the true faith, would endure even at the ends of the earth. And so Athanasius came to the end of his long war. The bishop who had defied emperors and changed the course of nations lay on his deathbed, his strength at last failing. As his fellow bishops and desert monks gathered around him, Athanasius whispered, "Remember Nicaea, remember the truth." With that, he gave up his spirit. The column of the faith, Athanasius contra mundum, entered into the joy of his Lord.